With you all in the great state of Nevada. I have had the immense pleasure of working with you all previously in the past, so I'm very excited to be back with you here at another wonderful digital learning summit. So my name is Ashley. I am a transformation coach at Link, the Learning Innovation Catalyst. A little bit about me. I'm a former 5th and 6th grade math teacher. I'm stationed over here on the East Coast. I'm in Baltimore, Maryland. So I'm 3 hours ahead of you. But I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to be a wonderful afternoon. We're going to have some very open and honest conversations. I love to just be open. I love participation in the chat. If you want to come off mute and share, I always say sharing is caring. Teachers have a great wealth of knowledge, and sharing that with your fellow educators is always one of my favorite best practices. So we're going to go ahead and jump on in. If at any time you have any questions, any comments, feel free to post them there in the chat, or come off mute and ask it there. I totally don't mind. But this is going to be very quick. I know we only have 50 minutes, but we're going to be talking all things equitable grading practices, what that may look like, and some resources of how we can really start to retrain our brain to approach grading in terms of making our grading practices equitable for all of our students. So we'll jump on in. Our goal for today is to examine the grading practices status quo and explore alternatives to current grading practices that we may already utilize in our classrooms, maybe some that are new to us, that our school is mandating, totally fine. And we're going to really think about those and how they can encourage a greater sense of agency and intrinsic motivation within our students. You're going to hear me talk about agency a lot today, and really how we can get our kids to want to be the best possible version of what a learner looks like in their eyes, and how they can really own their learning in the classroom. So my first question for you is, and I always love to start off with what we call connection before content. As educators, we always check in with our kids, right? We know SEL is incredibly important in the classroom, and building relationships and fostering a safe and wonderful environment for our kids in the classroom. But rarely do people often check in with us as adults, see how we're doing, ask questions to get us thinking, right? So my first question to you is, what is something you were passionate about or simply enjoyed as a kid? And you can pop that in the chat, or if you feel so inclined, feel free to come off mute. But what is something you were passionate about or simply enjoyed doing as a kid? Rebecca already in the chat: swimming, playing sports, reading and being outside. Absolutely. And these are things, again, we're intrinsically motivated. What are some things that we just did? We didn't care about the outcome, the accolades, winning trophies and awards, bike riding, reading. I need to get some tips from these reading people. I'm trying to be a better reader. So if you have any recommendations, send them my way. Watching sports. I hear you. I have 2 games today and tomorrow. I have to football, big football fan. Playing video games, spelling bees. Okay, Carl. All right. I hear you. For me, it was probably choir. I was in choir from 2nd grade in elementary school, probably all the way up through college. And then I ended up joining an all-female a cappella group in college, and that was one of my best collegiate memories. I loved doing that. Got a lot of avid readers in the chat. I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. And as I'm reading more audiobooks now to fit in during my commute. I hear you. That still counts, Christine. I appreciate that. That still counts. You're still getting in that reading time, right? I love it. I need to get more into audiobooks too. I feel like that would be a lot easier for me to take in information auditorially. Anyways, so as we think about ways that our children can impact their educational experience in the classroom, right? We're really going to talk about also some things of how we can intrinsically motivate them. What just when you talk about this certain thing with your kids, like what's the light bulb moment that's happening? You can see it in their eyes. So as we really start to think about those things, keep that in the forefront of your mind as we go through today. So with that in mind, how might we tap into the intrinsic motivation of our students, right? What would be the impact if we stopped grading and didn't have grades for a whole year? I know I probably have some admin in the room that are like, Ashley, what are you doing? No, it's not. But what would happen, right? Would our kids still want to learn? How would that impact you as an educator? Think about that. For some, that could probably have some steep implications. For others, that would probably be a breath of fresh air and probably take so much weight off your shoulders. Carl in the chat, we would focus more on teaching and less on grading. Absolutely. I don't know if any of you were like me at one point. I literally was grading everything I could get my hands on, and it took up my weekends, and I set boundaries for myself. But as we're thinking about what implications can come around grading, our current grading practices, keep that in the forefront of your mind in terms of, what could be, what would happen if we stopped grading things. Would our students be more participatory and engaged in class? Would our mental health and our physical health as educators, what would happen there? Show them how things relate to their lives personally. Yes. And they're more motivated to learn. I'm loving all this stuff in the chat. Figuring out what drives and interests them, providing project-based learning opportunities. Yes. Maybe more student-led and individual. Yes, Davis. Lower the stress level of students and us. Amen, Ian. Amen. Less anxiety for the kids who worry about grades. Absolutely. I have terrible performance anxiety, especially when it comes around to standardized testing. When I took my teaching exams and my praxis tests. Yeah, know all about that. So if we're feeling that as adults, right, we definitely know our students are feeling that as well. So in one sentence or less, if you want to think of just what word comes to your mind, what is the purpose of grading? What is the purpose of grading? Accountability, inform our instruction. Yes, feedback. And Christina, I'm gonna add a caveat to that. Feedback both ways, not just teacher to student, right? But student to teacher. Reteach, empowerment, indicate mastery of content, accountability, mastery, policy making. Yes, Sean. To see if students master concepts. To see where they are on understanding core concepts. Okay, yep. I'm seeing a lot of that coming up in the chat. And I've seen accountability too quite a few times as well. Measure mastery of standards. Absolutely. Nailed it, right? A lot of these things are what come to our mind automatically. Data collection, absolutely, in terms of what we're grading and how we're grading. If you're, again, we're like me, where you're taking every single piece of data, every piece of student work, observations of your kids, right? Anecdotals, formative assessment, summative assessment. We really think about the breadth of what it is that we're grading, but really truly why are we grading it? One, it can cause burnout for us because we're grading and paying attention to every single little thing. But more two, it starts to pigeonhole our kids. and puts them into categories, into buckets, into our classroom. Cynical view, motivation, and data collection. Absolutely. So historically, right, uncommon schools, and I want us to think more than just past the uncommon uncommon schools like charter network here on the East Coast, past that. So historically uncommon schools, right? Description of or descriptive of the initial practice of schooling during the Industrial Revolution. So who was the target audience? People they really wanted to get into schools to educate, to immediately work in factories, right? What are things that they would have to, or who would they have to pull in order to help feel successful and be successful and produce in these factories, right? We know school wasn't for everyone. And only half of 15 to 19-year-old white children attended school. Far fewer Black and students of color attended school. And schools were sites of forced cultural assimilation for both Native and First Nations children. And of course, we've seen a lot in the news around our Native and First Nations children in the fact of assimilation and coming into schools, only speaking a certain language, wearing certain clothing, right? And only teaching certain ideals, which of course puts pressure on school boards to create factory-ready graduates, right? We're only going to target certain demographics of people to work and do these things and produce and be in these factories. So we think about that as kind of the basis of why we do things the way that we do today, in terms of not only school policy, school structure, and things like that, but also too, what happened to intrinsic motivation. It was no longer, hey, you're going to go to school to kind of figure out what it is you want to do. It's you're going to go to school to figure out and do the things we want and or need you to do. So a lot of that, the factory work that we talked about. Which leads me to historically uncommon teaching. And that's going to be everything leading us up to remote learning that we have gone through. Maybe some of us are still going through hybrid learning. That really shook up the educational world. And I was coming out of the classroom literally at the very beginning of remote learning March 2020. And it changed forever the way that we work with our kids, structurally what that looks like, and to our access to tech. Right. So historically uncommon teaching. So how do we meet the needs of ever-changing students in an ever-changing world? And how do we transform and even recondition our thinking around school policies and grading in specific that have traditionally upheld exclusive practices? So now we're going to dive into a couple different ways and things of thinking in terms of approaching some things that are traditionally done in the classroom and in the school building, right? So narrative reports, if we're thinking about narrative reports versus your traditional report card. I was recently going through and I've somehow managed to keep all of my old report cards from like elementary school to high school, oddly enough, and just viewing the things that I was seeing, right? A, B, C, D, F, the things that you would traditionally see. Yeah, Felicia, I'm all mine in my mind when I was a teacher. See, you keep things like that. And then you go back and you look and you're like, but I got this A in choir. Why though? Like, I don't remember. Like, I knew I loved singing and being in choir class, but I don't necessarily remember what happened to lead up to that A, right? So narrative reports help you get a wealth of information on student progress, right? The Michigan Assessment Consortium says that narrative reports are written descriptions of current learner performance that provide useful information to support the educational growth of each learner, since they document achievement on agreed upon essential standards. The written description in a narrative report should often or always address the current strengths and areas for improvement in educational achievement, as well as the impending next steps of learning for each student. By providing written descriptions, teachers can describe in a more meaningful manner the nuances of student learning and achievement, and can be conveyed by single subject grades reported on a traditional report card. So I often like to think about this as going a little bit beyond writing your typical, like, Ashley was great or has a great attitude in choir. She needs to be a little less chatty kind of thing. That's targeting my behavior and not necessarily what it is that I'm actually bringing to the classroom, and or my processes of how I actually got to obtaining that A or whatever letter grade it is that I got, right? So some benefits might be students and parents get better, more precise information on student achievement across many standards within a content area. And especially if we're talking about creating opportunities for agency, accountability, and advocacy for our kids, we might see it for them. And I saw accountability come up quite a few times in the chat, so I know y'all are feeling this. But creating opportunities for accountability with our kids all starts when they can pinpoint and realize, A, what kind of learner they are in the classroom, but two, how they contribute to that classroom environment and ecosystem as they show up in the world and as they are a learner, right? So those grading policies that we have very often, if not all the time, coincide with that and even clash with that sometimes. Some other benefits, future teachers have a more detailed picture of a student's performance. Learning is emphasized rather than the accumulation of points to achieve a particular grade. Maybe you don't feel like grading that day and you just give XYZ points. Or maybe you had a conversation with a certain student after the fact, and they were able to explain something a little bit further, right? Students are described as individuals utilizing and using words rather than through the use of abstract letters and numbers, right? How I told you, I don't remember how I got that A in choir. Give me more information. How did I get there? And of course, it's going to be more beneficial and helpful for our parents too, when they're like looking at you with like you have 5 heads when you're talking about, oh, well, Ashley has an F. Why? So at least you'll have a little bit more information and knowledge that can back that up in terms of having parents assist and support their kids and taking ownership and accountability for their learning and grades. And then lastly, the relationship between the teacher and the student may be improved. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today simply revolves around relationships, and truly getting to know, learn, build rapport with your kids. A lot of this stems just from that alone. So we know that, grades were designed to sort, categorize, bucket. We talked briefly about that earlier. They were designed to sort our kids, not support them, right? Slightly off topic, but how do we sort our kids to figure out who's going to get into AP classes? And we look at the statistics and all of the things around who is getting into AP classes, right? Just a small little caveat to think about. Helps us categorize students, predict who's going to be the most successful in factory jobs, right? That is our assessment of our kids. And that end up oftentimes limiting their abilities, and truly not having them see themselves as the learner they want to present themselves as, and really kind of silences them in general as a human being. The push for need for standardized measures of progress, standardized testing, I just blanked. But standardized testing, frequent standardized testing, I could go on a whole tangent, I feel like, about that. But anywho, that's a huge one, right? Not only necessarily end of the year standardized testing, benchmark testing is another huge one. And a lot of kids have testing anxiety, just like me. And I'm a well-functioning adult. And I had testing anxiety, right? So that's something a little bit out there that's a little bit more common, that's not always taken into consideration when we do these big standardized tests and place so much emphasis and pressure on our kids for these standardized tests. And they're way more than that holistically, right? And then lastly, A through F grading systems. When we utilize them and we introduce them to our kids, we're automatically placing that badge almost kind of honor or dishonor on our kids. Often think of like the scarlet letter, for example, on our kids, and automatically just starting to label them, right, as problematic, or students who, for lack of better words, are lazy, unmotivated, right? So by automatically placing this heavy emphasis already on them, it creates a space of disengagement. They're already checked out. This is already what we're seeing. And they're going to replicate that quite frequently. So how are our traditional grading practices counterproductive to the learning that we want to take place, right? So if we think about our classrooms, what skills do we want our kids to cultivate in our classrooms? What skills do they need to thrive in post-graduation environments, whether that be graduation from high school, college, post-secondary, what have you, trade school, doesn't matter. But I think about all the times when I was in elementary school and or middle school and or even high school where I didn't receive basic, not only classes that could help me thrive post-graduation, but ways that I would be graded and held accountable, right, post-graduation, in the real world, at work, in a graduate level class and or course, right? And as we think about that, how are our grading practices counterproductive to the learning that is currently happening, that we want to see, right? So it all comes back to what systems are we putting in place that is really off-putting the things that we ideally want to see. We always say that modeling gets the best bang for our buck in terms of getting the best product that we want to see from our kids. And that really, honestly, that starts with our grading policies as well. So we know and understand that we have to create change, right? And this whole transformative process, we have to, it's amazing to change policies and do all these wonderful things and change the way that we actually physically do them, right? 100%. But oftentimes for a lot of people, in order to get to that particular spot in their actual practice, it comes with changing your mindset first. 100%, always. Change your mindset, you're able to change your practice. So as we think about that, we know it's necessary. So let's see what it may look like. I always come back to Simone Biles, especially in her most recent Olympic stint that she did, in the terms of her being bold enough to advocate for herself, right, and have agency, and say, no, I'm not gonna compete. I'm going to put my mental health first, and I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna reevaluate that, right? We know that she's the first female gymnast to ever try a very extremely difficult and dangerous move during a competition. But the judges were often saying, oh, we don't want her to get too far ahead of her competition, because a lot of the other people, women in the sport, couldn't even hold a lit candle to Simone Biles in terms of what she was able to actually do. And they were actually hindering her, right? Because what they were grading her on, and it was a 6.6, I'll never forget, it was a 6.6 score. Very low score for this. I can't remember the technical name of it, but I'm sure you've seen videos and or articles about it. It involved backflips. I'm not a gymnast at all. It involved a triple backflip coming off of a beam. I do know that. But the low score attributed how difficult it would be for other people to attempt what she did. And she actually did it. She did it 4 times within this one showcase. She did it 4 times. And she received a 6.6 really low score. So we often think about that and how hard and how difficult that move is, but it also makes us think too, the subjectivity of it, right? And if we think about the subjectivity of the judges and how they're actually going through and determining how this difficult move can get such a low score, we're actually thinking about grading, how we can curve in relation to other students and how other students are faring and comparing to each other in their own class and or across classes, across buildings. I know a lot for me when I was teaching in Baltimore City, we were often comparing our students to students in other districts and other states whose demographics were totally different. And that's a very unfair comparison, right? That's already setting up our kids for unequitable buckets and how we're going to see them and how the rest of the world is going to see them. So we're narrowing it down really ideally to a few criteria, but also comparing it and pairing it with our unconscious bias and how we actually feel towards our students and how we see them as a student and how that vision goes in with their actual work performance, right? And engagement in the classroom. And it's really subjective. Ultimately, grading is subjective unless we put some things in place where it makes those clear objectives accessible to all of our kids. We know that learning cannot occur without taking a risk, right? And I think one thing that has come out of this whole pandemic teaching has not only been for us as adults and educators taking a risk, we're like, pat yourself on the back. We have learned a totally different skill set of things and ways of actually executing and still having our kids learn, period. Still having our kids learn and us still learning ourselves, right? And our kids have also learned and they have learned an entirely different skill set. And I think that often gets set to the wayside there, right? So learning cannot occur without risks. Yet CASEL, the Collaborative for Academics, Social, and Emotional Learning, notes that 49% of high school students reported being afraid of making mistakes and taking risks. I want us to kind of marinate in that for a second. CASEL notes that 49% of high school students reported being afraid of making mistakes and taking risks. Now, note also too that those students, that demographic of high schoolers, are going to be the next ones that go to college, go into trades, go into the workforce, the military, start families, what have you. And what's going to happen, right, to all those different ecosystems and infrastructures if our kids are afraid of making mistakes and fail, like epically, like face planting and failing and taking risks, right? Just think about the repercussions of what can happen in all of those different ecosystems if that were the case. And if they're afraid of making mistakes, they're not going to step outside and take a risk, period. So what actions are students actually taking instead of taking risks? That's also something to think about. Is it behavioral disruptions in class? Is it not putting forth their best effort when you know and you have observed and you have seen, you've had conversations, and you know the student knows X, Y, Z, right? So with all of that in our minds fresh, our grading practices quite literally get an F. We know that. They stifle risk-taking and trust between us and the students students to us. They label our students, categorize them, put them into buckets, and internalize that they are either A, B, C, D, or F students. It hides information, invites biases, and provides misleading information, where some students may show up in a class with an immense amount of prior knowledge, and has little to nothing to what it has to do with the current class that they're in. Demotivates and disempowers our students, doesn't help our students self-identify who and how they are as learners. We talked about that agency piece and that advocacy piece, right? That's huge. That's incredibly important. And it also leaves parents little to no information on their students as well. So let's make change. Moving from a punitive action to a processes action. And what I mean by that is no longer punishing during the learning process. Correctness should not be the focus when a student is first learning something. Allowing the opportunity for mistakes, voicing that, having your kids voice that, and having it be okay. Having it be okay. We all make mistakes. We're all human. I call myself out in the classroom all the time. And my students certainly would call me out as well. And we have that mutual respect and mutual understanding of, if we're going to create a classroom of transformation and innovation, we need to have an open and honest conversation and mutual respect for each other in that sense. And of course, also too, that depending on your relationship and the grade level and all that stuff of your students. But next one, gotcha grading. This is a big one. Gotcha grading, where, oh, I'm going to give a pop quiz. I told you to do X, Y, Z to study. Gotcha, right? Which is mostly focused on behaviors. Are we having our students last minute trying to study? Have we said something so many times to our kids and they just are not paying attention to it, right? So moving from that gotcha grading, which is more focused on behavior, and moving towards clear expectations, which is more skill-based, right? Standards-based. Are we focusing on those power standards and really what our kids need to be successful for this grade level and to feel empowered and successful in the next upcoming grade level, right? Shifting to more understandable and transparent expectations, focusing on the skill itself, and having the objectives in student-friendly language. They're probably not going to understand the jargon of what we as adults are probably reading when we are first looking at these standards, especially if you're working with Common Core standards, right? There's a whole bunch of academic jargon in there that's just too much. Put it in student-friendly terms. Lastly, giving grades versus self and peer assessment. So having students evaluate themselves is huge. And having students be aware of their progress continually, not just when it comes up, summative assessments, benchmark testing at the end of the year, standardized testing, right? They should be aware of that process and how they are progressing as learners throughout the entire school year. So let's navigate to that new way. So equitable grading, and I'm going to give you a definition here from Joe Feldman. But as we look at the definition here on the next slide, think about this. How might the aspects of a student's life impact their ability to perform well in the areas that are getting ready to be listed in this definition? So the definition is Equitable grading has 3 pillars: accuracy, bias resistance, and intrinsic motivation. Grades must accurately reflect a student's academic level of performance, exclude non-academic criteria, such as behavior, and use mathematically sound calculations and scales, such as the 0 to 4 scale instead of the 0 to 100 scale. Okay, so we're going to talk about next some equitable grading possibilities. Let's ditch the zeros. You're probably like, oh, but if my students are not doing the work, how are we going to hold them accountable, right? We're going to have high expectations for all of our students. Know and understand that they have the ability to do the work that you're putting in front of them. Provide multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate those skills. And don't grade for components irrelevant to the learning objectives and skill mastery, i.e. taking into accountability spelling in an argumentative essay, right? Unless you are clearly stating and have gone through that expectation and it's listed on an evaluative rubric of sorts, right? Resubmissions. This was a lifesaver for me and my kids, especially during remote learning and teaching. This could mean that students have the capacity to explain why answers were incorrect after already turning an assignment in, and have the opportunity to redo an assignment, redo an assessment, but having some sort of protocol in place for that. We're not going to just let things fly willy-nilly, because that stresses me out. And I know that certainly stresses my kids out, but allowing them the opportunity to retake assessments. I also included assignments in this, requiring proof that the skills were mastered prior to resubmission. You're not going to sit here and just do an assignment 20 million times and hoping that 20 millionth time that it was all good. That's a lot on them. That's also a lot on me to go in and as the teacher to go in and look at all these, right? Have a process in place. What are some things that need to happen leading up to that where you can say, hey, all right, they're good to go ahead and redo that assignment and resubmit it, right? And I had a process in place for my kids where if they wanted to resubmit something, they would have to show me proof that they were ready, and they would fill out a form that lets me know that the assignment they need me to look at again, and the date that they resubmitted it. That way I knew I need to go back and look at that, and they would have it back in a certain amount of time. Rubrics and conferences. Dialogue often and in many formats. We talked briefly about data collection earlier in terms of what pieces of data are most important, and not necessarily grabbing every single piece of data and grading it, right? Co-creating goals and assessing together. And I love that someone mentioned in the chat earlier, feedback, super important, not only from teacher to student, but also from student to teacher. Allowing them to give peer-to-peer feedback, teacher-student feedback, opposite, and really being in conversation with students so they're clear, one, about the criteria needed in order to feel successful, but two, to help them really stay accountable of those personal goals. And I stepped away from me creating goals for my kids to us having a conversation about those goals and them really solidifying it. Because that took the ownership off of me and put that ownership and accountability onto them, and really help them know and understand what kind of learner they were and how they could advocate for themselves in the classroom, because we had that mutual understanding of how that grading process was going to work for them. Aligning grades to skills. Removing subjective elements. Catching your students actually owning the content. I called it like a gotcha moment. And I encouraged my students to do this with each other as well, and call it out and celebrate it, right? So going back to subjective elements really quickly, penalties for late work, weighted averages for quarters and or semesters, complex school codes around grades, and really thinking about our tardies, absences, and behaviors really factoring into my grading. If so, how is that impacting your kids? Owning the content. We used to do Thankful Thursday, things that we're thankful for. And it was really, one, an opportunity for my kids to celebrate things that were going on in their personal lives, but two, a great way for them to shout out and celebrate things that they were seeing their peers do as well. So catching them doing well. What skills are we assessing? Are there multiple ways of catching the data? Perhaps, a student is demonstrating mastery during a class presentation, but actually bombed, like me, on the standardized test, right? Or the summative assessment. So really giving them the opportunity of showing what they know in multiple ways and taking in consideration things that they're passionate about. Can they draw me a mathematical comic around equivalent ratios? Sure, right? Because that's including their passion, that's getting them to take a risk, think outside the box. And it's things that intrinsically motivate them and things that they actually appreciate and like. So capturing those mastery moments is always key. Lastly, we have single point rubrics. This is great for self-assessment in terms of assignments and or assessments. If you have your kids going in and utilizing the single point rubric to understand how they felt they did on an assignment. Whether it be my annotations, for example, here, my annotations are the key information and evidence of the documents. The evidence that I listed could be used to answer the essential question, so on and so forth. The columns there are broken down into I got it, I'm working on it, I need more support. And I've seen this done not only in rubric ways like this, but with exit tickets, with morning work assignments. And it's a great way to create small groups, figure out tutoring schedules and things like that, peer tutoring. My kids love that. But really utilizing single point rubrics for self-assessment and showcasing that. And it's a great ownership moment for them as well. So as we start to round out our time today, I have a resource that I definitely want to share with you. Let me grab it. This resource, there we go. It's a Padlet, and I think I have it pulled up here. Here we go. So in this Padlet, and you'll have access to it. So star it, save it in your browser tabs, what have you. You have commenting rights on this Padlet. So there's some resources there for you that can help guide towards equitable grading practices and shifts. Remember, we talked about transformation and how mindset, shifting mindset, needs to happen before those transformative practices can happen too, right? So there's some questions on there. Feel free, definitely put your thoughts in there. There are 4 questions. What is the purpose of grading? Is it accomplishing that purpose? How are current grading practices counterproductive to the learning we want to foster in our classrooms? A lot of these we talked about today. I would love for you to contribute, add to any of those as you see fit. This is going to be out there in the universe for you. So feel free to share it with colleagues that were not able to join us today. Totally fine. But definitely to add any thoughts that you may have there. And also in this last column, I have some resources there for you. Grading expectations, what we need to think about grading in our schools, mind shift, grades have a huge impact. And then there's 2 YouTube videos down there for you. But definitely take a look at that and add to it. And I'll come back and I'll take a look at it. But we're narrowing out our time here. So first and foremost, I greatly appreciate you coming and hanging out with me this afternoon for you as you round out and finish your day. I know that was super quick, but I would love to open up the floor if anyone has any questions, anything that they would like to add. Yes, Kathy in the chat, there's a survey link. This is session number 4. You need to take the attendance tracker survey to get credit for attending the session today. But
yeah, so you guys, I posted in the chat area just to let you know really quick, and then you guys can ask Ashley some questions that you might. Just a reminder, you guys take your attendance, and then you have to attend the closing keynote to get your professional learning hours. So make sure you go back to the agenda that's in Canvas, the schedule, and then just click on that link that that will take you to the closing keynote. And if you guys need that, then I can help you with that also. So Barbara, you said, are you, oh, go ahead, Mimi, there's a question for you there, Ashley.
yeah, thanks. Mimi, so I won't be sharing the slides directly, but if there's anything that you had specifically questions about, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. Feel free to email me and I can send any singular slides, screenshots, what have you, that way, certainly.
And I just want to, again, like give a shout out to Link, because I highly recommend that every one of you try to attend or go to their website, the linklearning.com. Can you put that up there, Ashley? And their November conference that's free. You guys, you're going to learn so much valuable information there. I can't tell you how incredible they are. I mean, I'm just like, woo-hoo. I was excited to have you guys here.
Yeah.
It's blended.
Thanks, Kathy.
Blended and personalized learning. They're very knowledgeable.
Yeah, we have our upcoming conference. We call it Link Stream. This year's theme, or this fall's theme, excuse me, is Pandemic to Progress. And we have a ton of workshops happening. If you go to linklearning.com and then you head over to our wonderful little mascot, Leah, Leah the llama here, she'll take you all to all of the amazing different streams we're going to have, information. We have some wonderful keynotes happening. So yeah, we'd love to have you there.
Did you show is that the conference that's on November 3rd and 4th?
Yep. November 3rd and 4th. I'll put it in the chat for you right there. Absolutely. Ooh, there we go.
Okay, so yeah, you guys, you must do the attendance, and you guys make sure that you head back over. The other session starts at 1:50. And oh, actually, let's see, what time are we starting over there? I have to go back and look. What is that? Oh, 1:40. So jump on over there, everybody, and go back to the main room. And I can put that schedule here. I'll put a link up there. So you should be going back to the main room. There we are.
Thanks, Rebecca.
If you guys can't find the link to go back to the main room, that takes you back to the page, the schedule page, and then click here to join for the closing keynote. And thank you, Ashley.
Yeah,
I will
absolutely. Thank you.
See you on November 3rd or 4th.
Yeah, I'll be there.
I love it. All right. Thank you, Ashley.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
You too.